thinking it was going to be later today.
When did you first hear you were getting out?
Oh, yeah, what time was it?
When y'all find out?
This morning. We got a letter.
Oh, did today gate
We went to the clerk's office. We got the letter.
Right. Oh, man. Oh, man, it's such a beautiful day. Man, it's a beautiful day.
Oh. Oh.
This is a beautiful day, y'all.
Even though it's a cold Tuesday.
I love it. I think it's so nice out here. JJ, you hung around.
I'm going in. She changed her flight.
Really? Oh, that's great.
Man, it's such a lovely day, y'all. Feel good, though.
My name is Ndume Olatushani. I was falsely accused of murder, and I ultimately spent 28 years in prison, and 20 of those years was on death row in the state of Tennessee for a crime that I did not commit.
In 1983, Ndume Olatushani was sent to prison for a crime that he did not commit. But where did it all start? How did it come to be that today, a man who is free and innocent could have been sentenced to be chained and bound when his only crime seemed to be that he was a young black man? The United States carceral system did not suddenly spring up because it was a burgeoning and growing modern society. There is a direct link to the history of slavery and colonialism in early America. Although slavery was abolished, its shadow still loomed over the structure of the U.S. social order. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution states, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." In other words, criminal equals slave. Fast forward to the 1970s, the war on drugs.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive.
Troops of people, the majority of whom were black and brown men and women, were carted off into prison for low-level offenses like possession of marijuana and heroin. By associating these minority communities with certain narcotics, the government, aided by mass media, could criminalize and isolate these communities. Today, Black Americans account for approximately 13% of the US population. Yet, 38% of the US prison population is made up of Black Americans, and 48% of that population is serving a virtual life or life without parole sentence. We have heard reports over and over and over again about the conditions within which incarcerated people are forced to endure. Basic necessities like good food and healthcare are denied to them. The 13th Amendment makes it clear how much the state values the lives of incarcerated people. Although this is extremely important, the concern of this story is time, the irredeemable currency that once stolen cannot be replaced. The state has deemed time as the appropriate punishment for crimes committed against the law. Why? Because the nature of time as immovable, unforgiving, and somewhat impartial is what is weaponized. If you're locked in a cage and bound and shackled for a year, 2 years, 10 years, that time cannot and will not be returned. This is the fate that those who are subjected to the US carceral system must face. The hypercriminalization of Black and brown people by the media presents us as a threat to our perfectly functioning society. The legal framework is supposed to be based on justice and fairness, and it seems to do the exact opposite for minority communities. In this case, you're guilty even after you're proven innocent. when false facts and figures can be laid out in front of a biased jury and the person is ultimately sentenced to jail for a crime that they did not commit. This was the case of Ndume Olatoshani. His artist statement reads, "I was a young black male accused of killing a well-respected white man. It took the all-white jury 2 hours to come back with a guilty verdict. It took this same jury of my peers nearly the same amount of time to come back with its decision to have me executed for a crime. It didn't matter that I was not guilty. 2 hours was enough to decide to end a man's life."
When I think about the word incarceration, I usually think oppression and a hoax. And that's because I think incarceration or the prison system has been marketed as a reformative place, a place where, people who break laws go to get reformed to fit better into society. But in actuality, it's a place where if you pass through it and come back into society, it actually makes you even more far removed from it.
In her book, The Culture of Punishment, Michelle Brown says, "Punishment always represents a collective decision to build inequalities, to respond to pain and violence through its infliction. It is ultimately a violence and force, particularly compelling in the way in which it extends throughout its social patterns and institutions, and the manner in which it intersects with social vulnerability." So, herein lies a huge problem. There is a systematic inequality in the way that the United States culture of punishment works. Its roots in slavery and the hyper-criminalization of black and brown people make it so that existing as a minority in this country can be a crime in itself. The media, whose job is to represent truthfully and fairly, does the exact opposite and plays into the hands of a racist and unfair system to perpetuate untrue and unjust stereotypes. So what does one do? How does one resist the behemoth that is the U.S. carceral system?
I knew I had to get up. And one thing that I knew that the people couldn't do to me is what I said to you a little while ago, and that is that they could do whatever they wanted to do to me physically, because hell, I couldn't do nothing about that. But the one thing that they couldn't do is take my mind.
For Ndume Olatoshani, art was his resistance. It was a way to ensure that although his physical body was shackled and bound in the 4x9-foot cell that he was forced to live in, his mind was in no way captured. He says, "Ironically, it was not until I was sent to death row for a crime that I did not commit that I found my creative space dwelling within me. As I sat in a tiny cell on death row, with the prison system denying my humanity at every turn, I bent inward and found my own creativity as a means of raw survival and resistance. You see, I did not understand the fullness of my own humanity, or that I came with a built-in creative spirit. If you have ever been inside a jail or a prison, you know it is an environment that is devoid of color. If there is paint on the walls, it is a dull off-white, battleship gray, or some drab equivalent. Painting allowed me to resist in color. Even in the act of holding a paintbrush, there was a resistance to penal matter."
We had to file lawsuits and other stuff that, just to be allowed to have certain things to explore our creativity, right? I didn't create art on everything that I can get my hands on. I'm talking about from a brown paper bag to using coffee grounds to come up with some cup. But some of the most innovative people I know are sitting in prisons across this country. You see what I'm saying? And one of the things that I did when they would cut the paintbrushes, my paintbrushes, I would just take old newspaper or magazine pages and wet them and just roll them really, really tight to make a stick. And once the stuff dried, it was hell just as hard as the wood that I was putting it on.
And so, in what ways does art resist the penalty in the US cultural system? It reclaims time. Although one cannot get back the years that have been seized and stolen, one can choose to reclaim the time by accessing modes of resistance that are inaccessible to the state. For Ndume, this was his mind. There is a mental freedom that the carceral state cannot penetrate, regardless of how hard it tries to. The incarcerated person is further liberated when worlds and ecospheres are built within the safety of the mind through visual art, music, poetry, writing. Then there is the issue of representation. Looking at the bright and beautiful reds, the vibrant and viscous yellows, and the earthy and lively greens in Ndume's work says, I will tell you the complicated and undiluted truth of who I am. I will tell you what I feel, and I will tell you what I know. Whether you like it or not, you will listen. In the carceral state, art is an alarm clock. Ndume said it best.
Like I said, throw an alarm clock in the graveyard and wake up the walking dead, you know what I mean?